and welcome to An Afternoon with the Author. I'm your host, Deidre Teagarden, and on behalf of everybody here at the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, thank you for joining us and welcome. Before I introduce our very special speaker today, Mr. Bruce Henderson, I just wanted to share a few quick housekeeping items for those who are new to our Zoom program. As always, we love to take questions. So feel free to type in your questions as they come to you in that little question and answer box at the bottom left of your screen, and we will get to as many as possible before the end of the program today. Mr. Henderson has also graciously offered to sign book plates. So if you have purchased the book, or if you haven't purchased it yet but are planning to, and you'd like to get a book plate, please let me know. You can email me after the talk today. And as it relates to the books, you can get them at brucehendersonbooks.com. They're also available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and everywhere that you like to get your books. It's a wonderful novel, one we highly recommend. Why not get two and give one away for the upcoming holiday season? And finally, if you are new to the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, please check us out on the web at nvmc.org. You can also check out our YouTube channel, Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, and you'll be able to see this recorded talk as well as talks that we have done in the past. So please take a moment to do that. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Bruce Henderson. Bruce Henderson is the author of more than 20 nonfiction books, including a #1 New York Times bestseller that was made into a highly rated television miniseries. His books have been published in 20 countries. His latest book, and the one about which he is speaking today, Bridge to the Sun, The Secret Role of the Japanese Americans Who Fought in the Pacific in World War II, is one of the last great untold stories of that war. It is a gripping true tale of courage and adventure, the saga of the Japanese American U.S. soldiers who fought in the Pacific theater against Japan, while many of their parents were being rounded up and put into internment camps across the United States. His previous book, the New York Times bestseller, Sons and Soldiers, The Untold Story of the Jews Who Escaped the Nazis and Returned with the U.S. Army to Fight Hitler, is the little-known saga of the young German Jews dubbed the Ritchie Boys, whose families sent them out of Nazi Germany to safety in America and who returned as soldiers to Europe at enormous personal risk as members of an elite U.S. Army unit to play a key role in the Allied victory. And he is also the author of Hero Found, the greatest POW escape of the Vietnam War, the story of the legendary Navy pilot Dietler Dengler, with whom Bruce served aboard the aircraft carrier USS Ranger during the Vietnam War. Hero Found was a national bestseller, and it was made into the feature film Rescue Dawn. He is a former newspaper reporter, magazine editor, private investigator, and a field producer for television news. He has taught reporting and writing courses at Stanford University and the USC School of Journalism. A member of the Authors Guild, he lives outside San Francisco, California, and has graciously agreed to join us for Zoom today. Please help me give a virtual Maui welcome to Mr. Bruce Henderson. Bruce, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you, and we're so excited to hear your presentation and just have a really lovely chat and ask you some questions. So I will turn it over to you, and thanks so much.
Great. Well, I thought I would share with you how I heard about the MIS Nisei who served in the Pacific. I was researching Sons and Soldiers at the archives, and of course those Ritchie boys were trained by the Military Intelligence Service to go to Europe and use their German language skills. And I came across the fact that there were several thousand Japanese American soldiers who were trained at another camp, Camp Savage initially, and also by the Military Intelligence Service, and sent to the Pacific to do the same, on the same mission, interrogate prisoners, interpret and translate. And what surprised me was I'd already written some World War II books, and in fact, a couple about the Pacific War. And I had no idea that there were Nisei soldiers in the Pacific. Now, I certainly knew about the ones who went to Europe with the 100th Infantry and the 442nd, and about 20,000, I think, and fought in Italy and France. And it's said to be, you know, one of the, if not the most highly decorated small unit of that war. And they were very well known, even during the war, and certainly in the years after. There have been books and movies about them. But why didn't I know about these 4,000 guys that went to the Pacific in a war against, we were fighting against, well, their ancestral homeland. And even though they were born in America and were as American as any other GI, a lot of them did have connections to Japan. They certainly had relatives, friends, a number of them, the Kibe, a good number of them had gone as boys, been sent over to Japan to go to school for a year or 2 or 3 years, and then returned, of course, before the war started. And they went, parents sent them there, and it was not uncommon, particularly the sons, for them to learn their culture, the language, their history, get to know the relatives, that kind of thing. So what was very interesting then when I got into it, anyway, I made a note to myself, when I finished Sons and Soldiers, I'm going to circle back and look at these Nisei who were in the Pacific. And that's exactly what I did. And that started a 4-year journey. And it would be about 2 years researching it and almost that writing it. And I had to, what I like to do when I'm writing a history book, and what I did on Sons and Soldiers, is I like to tell a big story through a few who lived it. And so I have what I call a small cast. In Sons and Soldiers, we followed 6 of those Jewish Ritchie boys through the entire war. And I wanted to do the same with Bridge to the Sun, and I did do the same. And it's no accident that my cast in this book is also six soldiers. And how I chose them, first of all, I should say, it is getting more difficult to find World War II veterans alive and well to interview. I mean, there are some out there. In fact, 2 of my 6 Ritchie boys are still alive at age 100. So if they're listening, I know some of you are still, and I know some of them are still here. Some of you fellows are listening today for World War II vets, no doubt. But just from a historian standpoint, it's getting more difficult to find those folks. So how do we get the information that we need as writers, as historians, as military historians, as authors? And if we can't interview them ourselves, the only real way to get them is through oral histories or other interviews that they've given over the years. And they have to be pretty lengthy. And we want not just a military resume, but we want to know how they were thinking and feeling and what their fears were and their thoughts and all of that inner stuff as well. And even though it's a nonfiction book, I want my books to read like a novel, and I hope they do. And I hope when the readers read this book, I think these guys are going to come to life for you. I hope they do. They came to life for me. I did, by the way, there was one of my cast was still alive when I started, Kazu Komoto, and he was 99 years old. I did get to meet him. I did have interview him for a couple hours in the afternoon, and he died shortly thereafter. But I had a lot of information already on him, and he became a very interesting character in the book. He was actually in the first class at Camp Savage, and ended up at New Georgia in the invasion of the Solomons, and was shot in the knee in July 1943, which made him, I guess it's a distinction, the first Nisei to be wounded in World War II, because that was even before the 442nd got over to Europe. And of course, he got the Purple Heart. Also, there were some very interesting things about Komodo. He was in Army hospital recovering in Fiji when Eleanor Roosevelt came through on a tour. She was visiting many, many military hospitals. And when I say visiting, she was going basically to every bed and meeting hundreds, literally hundreds, and probably thousands of wounded GIs. And in his case, she came to Komodo's bed, and the doctor introduced her as one of the, explained that he was one of the Nisei interpreters and translators. And she asked him some very motherly questions, and he said that what he decided to do was to tell her what was really on her mind. And by all accounts, Komodo was a rather humble, quiet young man. And yet what he did was he looked at the president's wife in the eyes and said, "Mrs. Roosevelt, my family is in a camp in the desert in Arizona. They've been taken away from their home." They lived in California. "And they're there behind barbed wire. And I'm out here being shot. And I don't think that's fair." Mrs. Roosevelt said, "Well, I will be sure and tell the president your feelings," which as if he didn't already know. But Komodo later reported that he felt guilty challenging the president's wife in that way, but he just felt this was an opportunity he couldn't let pass. Well, then he came back to California and spent another month in the hospital recovering. And when he finally was discharged from the hospital, he had leave to go see his family in the camp in Arizona. And he took the train and the bus, and he got off one town before the camp. He'd heard that they didn't get a lot of fresh meats and that kind of thing in the camp. So he was going to go shopping, decided he would go shopping and take some good cuts of meat into the camp for his family. So he went into a small grocery, and he went to the back where the butcher was. And he looked at it and he says, "Yes, I would like to have, please, that cut and that there." And the butcher looked over at him and said, "We don't sell to no Japs here." And Komodo was in his uniform and had his ribbons on, including the Purple Heart. And Komodo said, "I'm not a Jap, I'm an American, and I still want that meat." And the butcher ended up, I guess, as if he saw the uniform then for the first time, said, "All right, what do you want?" Komodo took the meat to his folks. But this is an example of what I call them fighting two wars simultaneously. They were in the Pacific fighting that war, and not only trying to stay alive in that war, at the possibility of being shot by the enemy, and if they were captured, God help them. But also they were ethnic Japanese, and they had the face of the enemy. There was nothing they could do about it. They were in an American uniform. There was the very real possibility of being shot by friendly fire, and some of them were. And I do have a case in the book where we talk about that. And so they were there, but at the same time, they had a war at home that they knew they were going to have to go back to. And that was a war against prejudice. It was a war against racism. It was somehow to get their families out of those camps and somehow recover some of what they had been taken away from them quite fairly. And by the way, of the 120,000 ethnic Japanese who were put in camps in World War II, 60% of them were American citizens. And just rounded up. Now, the irony is that these young boys who went over to Japan and got educated for 2 or 3 years, the Kibe, and came back. Initially, the government said anybody of the Japanese race who has any connections to Japan, who's been over there, gone to school there, or anything, we cannot trust, because they might be loyal to the emperor and not to America. So there they were, of course, in the camps with their families if they lived on the West Coast, which most of them did. But now, 3 or 4 months into the war, when the Army is already training the Ritchie boys to go to Europe, and they're realizing they've got a language problem in the Pacific. They need to have language skills in the Pacific because a lot of the Japanese Army messages were being sent out without even being coded, because they felt that the Westerners were generally not going to be able to read and write and understand what they were saying. So they had sort of this arrogance about where our language was protected, in the Pacific. That's one reason why it was very, very secret when we started training these MIS Nisei. But suddenly they decide the Kibe are really valuable because they've gone to school in Japan and can read and write this very difficult language. So they went into camps to recruit. And one of the characters in my book, Roy Matsumoto, who became really a legendary member of Merle's Marauders, he was in the camp when the recruiter came in. And Roy had been very upset that he had been declassified from 1A to 4, whatever it was, E, because he was, foreign alien or whatever, and they weren't going to let him go in the Army. But he was the first guy to step forward. And he was one of about 12 in that camp that volunteered, took the oath right there. And he was, delighted to have the opportunity to do that. But he was also a little irritated that he had been thrown in his camp in the first place and felt that he wasn't trustworthy. But now, of course, the Army decided Uncle Sam needs you, and he became very valuable to the Army, as did all of these guys. So that's some of what I've covered in the book. If you've got some questions to ask, that would be happy to answer.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to go back to what you were talking about earlier, that big story, writing a very big story through a few select individuals, and the intimacy that you are able to portray through your writing. And I just have to share, so Melanie Agrabanti is our research archivist. And just for some background information, she has been with the center before we were even built. She started as a volunteer, and I had the wonderful opportunity to spend so much time with these men when they were still here with us, 100th, 40, 42nd, but also military intelligence service. And she said, reading your book, it made me feel like I was still sitting in the room talking story with these guys. So I just wanted to share that with you before too much time went on. And
I love that, and thank you for sharing that. And they, as I say, certainly came to life for me.
Yeah, you can certainly tell, and the care with which you wrote everything. You were talking about the men who were families were in the internment camps. They were in the internment camps themselves. And obviously how they felt about that was something that you've shared in the book. But did you want to expound on that a little bit? How the families were in the camps, but they wanted their sons to be loyal, for America.
Yeah. One of the the parents, of course, who came over from Japan, there were laws and it was often state by state, even county by county, but essentially there were all of these anti-Asian laws, and they weren't allowed to own any property. They weren't allowed to be naturalized citizens. They weren't allowed to study and become an American citizen and take the oath, and they were forbidden from doing that. So they were Japanese citizens, and of course, when we ended up being at war with Japan, they were considered enemy aliens, whereas their offspring, born in the United States, were of course American citizens at birth. But their parents clearly had some conflicts in terms of emotionally and whatnot, because it was their and a lot of shame from what I've read. I mean, a lot of those parents told their sons, they were ashamed of what Japan did, and and they told their sons, that's our country and we have to live with that. But this America is your country and you need to go and defend her. And so they really gave their, approval, if you will. And I remember one of the mothers, and I'm not sure now which of my characters it was, but one of them, as he was getting on the bus to go, into the army, the mother looked at him and said, "Make us proud." And that's what those boys were out to do.
And they did that. And I think you were saying earlier about how they were really fighting those two wars, the war abroad and then that war of racism. And I think was it Truman who said, paraphrasing, but you fought not only the enemy, but you fought here at home and you won.
That's right.
They were able to really change the way the United States looked at Asian Americans and Japanese Americans moving forward.
I must say, though, it's not to say we don't have more work to do. And in fact, even though I came across this topic in a serendipity kind of way, and I'm so glad that I saw it when I was at the archives, but I think that there's no better time than today for this book, this kind of book, to be published. Sadly, there's so much of this anti-immigrant sentiments. I mean, we're still prevalent, and that in America, we're still too often prejudging people based on race, ethnicity, countries of origin. And what these Nisei showed in World War II is really, I think, a timeless message of what not only courage, but what true patriotism is. And I think that's a message that shouldn't be forgotten.
I know you shared some photos with us, and would you like to?
Yeah, let's go
put
through
those
them
up little by little here, and I'm going to start with the first one.
Okay, so this is at one of the camps, and this is a picture of the young men who have volunteered and or actually taken the oath right there in the camp. And the camp that Roy Matsumoto was in Arizona, he was one of 11 or 12. This is not a picture that he's in, but he mentioned that what happened was they took these guys out of the camp at 4 a.m. by the back gate because they were afraid. They didn't want any kind of demonstrations in the camp if there were, people thinking that the U.S. Army was coming in and taking these young men out. And so, and there certainly were some folks in the camps, and certainly we've heard of the No-No Boys, and there was a contingent of people in the camp who were damn bitter about being there, and you can't blame them. So they were having to go out the back gate, and I love that.
Yeah, I did not know that. Let's see, we're going to go into the second photo here. Bear with me. So, you mentioned the No-No Boys, and what an interesting story that is as well.
Yes, as a matter of fact, one of my characters, Gordon Hirabayashi, his cousin my character is Grant, and his cousin is Gordon, who became probably the most famous resistor. He refused to be rounded up and to register and all of that. And his case went all the way to the Supreme Court and lost during the war. He ended up doing prison time. And those two cousins were raised. I mean, when cousins are cousins, and sometimes you got a cousin you've never met them, but those two boys were raised as kids. Their families lived on the same farm, and Grant became a war hero, and Gordon became another kind of hero for the folks who wanted to resist and felt that Americans were being denied their rights. And those two cousins, it never came between them. Grant and Gordon never lost respect for the others, the decision that the other one made. And I really love that, and I cover that in the book. This is at the MIS language school, and we've got a couple other shots too in the classroom. This was a very, very difficult school. I mean, I got a list here in the book of some of the courses that they had to take. I mean, they were doing Japanese reading and translation. They were doing English. They were doing military terms, both Japanese and American. They were working with interrogation methods, what you could and couldn't do with prisoners of war. They were learning the Japanese shorthand. They were doing Japanese geography. They were learning how to monitor radios. They were to intercept messages. They were getting lectures on Japanese society, history, politics. I mean, you know, it had to be equal to any kind of college course. And it was not 4 years, it was 6 months. Initially, it was going to be a year, but then they needed these guys out in the field so desperately that they crammed it all into 6 months. And they all talked about having to study after the lights went out. The only place they could go is in the restrooms and study, because that was where the lights were left on. Yeah, here they are at their desk. It was just a lot of studying, and they were just bright young men who took it in, and a lot of them were just honest high school graduates. When I say that, I mean, we're not, and this is equal to a graduate degree, the kind of courses they're taking. I think there's another one too on the.
Yes, and I think you were also talking in the book, I forget who it was, but not only did, like you say, they study the language and the customs, but you know, they were told, you know, if you end up interrogating a prisoner of war from Japan, you know, borrow somebody's jacket so you look like you are a higher rank.
Yeah.
What was that?
Yeah, that was, yeah, well, in fact, that was also true for the Germans in Europe, but they didn't want, you know, they felt that if you had a little more authority going into the interrogation, that you might be more, you might be able to get more information out of them. And I should mention just quickly in passing that the Japanese soldiers were told that you should not be captured, never be captured. Consequently, they were not trained as to what to do if they were captured. They did not know about the Geneva Convention Code. They did not know that if they were captured, they only had to give name, rank, and serial number. So once they became prisoners, and once they realized that the Americans were not going to torture them to death, but will give them a cigarette and a candy bar and take care of their wounds, they actually became quite talkative and quite helpful. The only thing that most of them requested was, please don't put my name on a list for the Red Cross to say that I was captured, because I'm ashamed and I don't want my family to know, and I can never go home to my family. This is Merle, General Frank Merle of Merle's Marauders, and these are his, he had a contingent of 14 Nisei interpreters assigned to the Merle's Marauders, which was about a 3,000 man unit that was fighting a really tough war in Burma. And these are his two personal interrogators or interpreters and translators that he had with him. They didn't take many prisoners. The Merle's Marauders did. The one on the left is Herbert Miyazaki, and he's actually from the Big Island. And he had originally been with the 100th Infantry Regiment, and then was recruited for Camp Savage before going overseas with the 100th. And he ended up staying in the Army and retired as a lieutenant colonel. And the other fellow, Yoshimura, is from California. That's a great picture, though.
It is. It is.
Next one.
Yes. Here we go.
Oh, and the other thing, notice that they don't just have pencils and dictionaries. somebody asked me this the other day. I'm in the middle of doing a 30-city radio tour right now, and they said, well, so these guys just sat around reading and writing and stuff like that. And I go, no, they were in a war. They had guns. They knew how to shoot them. And my gosh, they had to do everything. They had to do the translation and the documents, but then they had to, be sure that they were infantrymen essentially.
Right.
Okay, so this is the, and I really challenged my researcher back in Washington, D.C. once I knew about Komodo's story being greeted by Mrs. Roosevelt bedside. I said, look, she got a lot of photo coverage. She's the president's wife going in, visiting military hospitals. If we can find a photo of her at the bedside with my guy, I will love that. And it took my researcher about a month, and he found it. And I was
Wow.
delighted. Look at that look on his face and how excited and everything is. But now just imagine within a few seconds, he's now going to talk. He's now going to tell her what he's really feeling. So that's not easy to do.
No, it's not, especially when you are, Japanese American and you are taught to be respectful and,
Right.
But what a wonderful thing he did. And what a
Yeah.
wonderful thing, she was able to go back and talk to her husband. So
Now, this is Komodo, and I love this photo. It almost makes me cry every time I see it. This is when Komodo goes back, again, he's going to visit his family in the camp, and he's taken that fresh meat into them and everything. And he also took his Purple Heart to show them. And that's his little brother. And gosh, that's a wonderful picture, isn't it?
it sure is. I mean, there's just so much emotion there.
Yeah.
Very, very special.
And by the way, Komodo recovered from being shot in the knee, and they tried to give him some kind of desk or administrative duty, and he wouldn't have it, and got back to the Pacific and was head of his own 12-man MIS team. So he saw more action.
Go on to the next one. I think this is Warren Higa.
Yeah, this is Warren Higa, one of the Higa brothers of Oahu. They were Okinawan. Their parents were Okinawan. Warren and his brother Takahiro were both born in Hawaii, but then the parents took them to Okinawa. Takahiro was only 2 years old. Warren was 5 or 6, and then they split him up. The father brought Warren back to Hawaii, and then Takahiro stayed in Okinawa with his mom, who subsequently died. And actually, the father subsequently died in Hawaii, and it was an older sister in Hawaii who Warren ended up living with. But Takahiro stayed in Okinawa until he was well into his teens, and then he joined his sister in Hawaii and went to high school there. I'll tell you a little bit more about him when we see a picture of Takahiro. And I'm probably not pronouncing the name correctly, but
it's an amazing story, the Takejiro story.
yeah, here's the Higa brothers, and so that's Warren on the left and Takahiro on the right. And when Takahiro is one of the 6 major characters, although of course Warren is in the book as well. And he was recruited for the MIS, and when he joined, and signed up, and he was his worst fear was that he would end up on Okinawa, fighting on Okinawa against a relative. He had cousins there, and he certainly had schoolmates and friends, and he had no problem fighting the Japanese army, but he really hoped that it wasn't, that he didn't have to fight any of his relatives that he knew on Okinawa. And of course, once he was trained and then was assigned to a unit, he went to an infantry division in the Philippines. And of course, they were planning the invasion of Okinawa. And when they found out that he had been raised there they called him in to the planning office, intelligence office. And right away, he started identifying stuff. They thought that these were machine gun pillboxes on the coast that they would have to get rid of. And they were showing him air reconnaissance photos. And he looked at them and he said, no, those are family tombs, and it's probably not a good idea to blow them up. And so they figured they really needed him. And so for a whole month, every day they called him in, and here he was planning the invasion of Okinawa. And of course, that worried him. When he hit the beach there, immediately almost he gets involved in trying to talk the civilians, the Okinawan civilians, to keep them from killing themselves. I mean, there were horrendous scenes of mothers holding babies jumping off cliffs because they had been brainwashed that the Americans were going to do such horrible things to them. And, you know, they would go into these caves 100, 200 at a time and ready to blow themselves up. And so fellows like Takahiro would get outside these caves with the bullhorn, and he had the same, he had the same thing he would say every time. He'd start off with, I am an Okinawan boy. I am in the American Army. We will not hurt you. We will take care of you. We will feed you. He went through that whole thing. I am an Okinawan boy. And then boom, he had to leave, usually without knowing how many people came out, if any, and then go to the next cave. And the team that he was with ended up being credited with them alone bringing out something like 30,000 civilians from these caves and when Takahiro 50 years later goes back to Okinawa as a man in his 70s, one of the then girls, now an older lady, makes a point of meeting him and thanking him for her life, that, you know, because she left the cave because of him. And for him, that was a final lasting. He did his job. He never fired his rifle, didn't have to fire his rifle on Okinawa, and he saved lives. And, you know, so that wrapped up, you know, the war for him.
That's such an emotional story, the Takejiro Higa story. And you captured it so beautifully in the book. You know, let's go back and talk about, you know, how many MIS Nisei were actually in the Pacific, and how many Nisei soldiers in the war.
Yeah, there were about 34,000 Nisei soldiers in the war, and about 20,000 went to Europe. And there were about 6,000 who graduated from Camp Savage and later Camp Snelling, the language school. And of those, about close to 4,000 went to the Pacific. And the one thing I did in the book, and it was a little bit of a battle with my publisher, because when you add pages to a book, it adds the cost and the shipping and all of this kind of nice. What I wanted was a roster at the end of the book of every Japanese American who served in the Pacific. And the Java folks, really, one or two of their researchers spent over a year culling through all of the graduation records of the MIS-LS and figuring out who went to the Pacific, and gave me this list. And I thought, how can I not have this in my book? I mean, as a historical document. And I did the same thing for the Ritchie Boys and Sons and Soldiers. And I have to tell you, I am not exaggerating. To this day, I probably get a dozen emails a month from relatives who, you know, who say, you know, I didn't know my father, my grandfather was a Ritchie boy, and I read that in your book. So I'm hoping that families will, you know, see the list of Nisei and make some of those discoveries.
Before I ask another Nisei question, you know, your books are very heavy topics, and it's such a responsibility to write these stories. How as you are writing the stories, or as you are researching them, how does that impact you, not necessarily as a writer, but as a human being?
Well, that's probably a question you should ask my wife, because I come out of my office and she says I kind of, in one way I guess I kind of have steel compartments, because I can't take it all, everything with me. I can't take it to the dinner table. I mean, I can't take it when we take an afternoon off. I have to somehow, I have to leave it somewhere. But you're seeing right now behind me, this is my sanctuary. And when I'm here and when I'm learning about these guys and when I'm interviewing their family members and when I'm looking at pictures of them and everything, I'm totally immersed in it. And there are some wonderful moments. And my guys, I mean, my guys, that's what I call them. They all came home alive. I love that. And they all had, lives, families, and fairly long lives. So they served and they came home, and there's a lot to like about that,
Yeah. So getting back to the book, was there any concern about the Nisei being mistaken for the enemy in the Pacific?
Yes, in fact, in some of these assaults, they had a security person assigned to them just to ensure that they wouldn't come across some soldiers who didn't know who they were, some Americans, and be shot. And in fact, there was the team one team that was going over on a troop ship over to the Pacific, and they were on a ship with like 3,000 GIs, most of them from Texas. It was a National Guard unit out of Texas. But they thought we better keep these 12 Nisei below deck, and they told them not to come out. And they had their own quarters. And as the guys up above deck started talking, we've got Japanese POWs aboard. Let's get them and throw them overboard. Well, what the officers decided we better bring our Nisei up and introduce them to the rest of the guys and let them know that they're with you. So they brought him up and they said, these guys are American as you, right? Some of these guys from Texas had never even seen a Japanese American. I mean, they didn't know. I mean, they looked like the enemy. They must be the enemy. And so, and then they were told, look, not only you can take care of these guys are Americans, but take care of them, because where we're going, they're going to be real valuable, and they're going to help. They're going to help us, win battles, and they're going to save American lives. And that really was the case that throughout. There was not any, I did not come across any outright racism by other GIs at all. I mean, again, there were some accidental shootings, but yeah.
So your takeaways from the book, from the research that you've done, what are they?
Well, I think I kind of touched on that earlier.
Yeah.
I feel that this is just the right time for this story to be told, and it's here these young men with these ancestral ties to a nation that we're at war with and distrusted for that reason, and of course for the reason of nothing that they could do about it. Their parents were Japanese, and so they were Japanese, except they were Americans, and they became huge assets to our military because they knew the enemy so well, particularly in the case of the Kibe, who went there to that country. So I just think that, again, it's a message about not only patriotism and fighting for one's country, but that we all come from somewhere, and let's not forget that. And when you're stepping forward to defend your country, that's a noble thing. And that the fact that they did it in the face of their parents being from Japan, and that did not deter them at all, because that was not their country. America was their country.
We have someone who just texted in. He says, thank you so much for writing this book. His father was MIS, but the father never talked about it. He didn't know his father was MIS until years later. And he just he said the book is just, so compelling and allows him to understand his father a little bit better.
Well, that's so great to hear, and I hope he found his father in the back of the book in the roster. I hope we got him.
We will have to follow up with that, and yeah, a very, very similar comment is coming in again. This is such an untold story. Everybody, people are more used to hearing about the 100th, the 442nd, and thank you so much for really bringing to light the service of the military intelligence. And
It was really my honor.
so, what is next for you?
Well, I'm looking at a couple of stories, and another. I'm going to stay in World War II as long as I can. I mean, it's a viable. I love that people are still interested, and obviously, it's not just the World War II generation now. It's the younger generations are interested in reading about that war, and I always look for. I mean, I always look for people and characters. I won't just do a book on the Battle of Midway. First of all, it's been done hundreds of times, but I'm looking for something, something special and unique, and how individuals really meet the moment. And that hero, my wife says, "Oh, Bruce, you're always looking for heroes," and it's true.
Everybody loves a hero. We are gently coming to an end. I wanted to also touch on the fact that your dedication in the book was for them all. And even though you picked 6 characters, the book, you were talking earlier about this being for everybody, for all of us.
Yes, and if I have anything I'm sorry for, it's that I couldn't have twice as many, or 3 times as many, and it again became like how much I wanted to delve into each of the characters, and there was a limit to what I could do in terms of the number. And I remember the first military history book I read, and I was barely in my teens, was by Cornelius Ryan, called The Longest Day. And the way he wrote is he had a cast of hundreds and hundreds, but he might just write a paragraph about a corporal from, St. Paul who was, jumped with 101st on D-Day. And then that's it. You don't come back to him. And that was certainly an incredible work of history, considering how many people he accounted for and the different units and getting so many names into his book. But that's the antithesis of what I do. And what I like to do is get, really deeper into the characters.
You definitely do that. It's a very beautiful, emotional, poignant book, and a wonderful tribute to these individuals. I'm going to come back to you in just a few minutes for some closing remarks. To everybody else, we want to thank you for being on the call today. And if you are interested in having Mr. Henderson do a signed book plate for you, please email me. Our November is going to be very exciting as well, starting on November 11th with our annual dinner here on Maui. Tamlin Tomita of Cobra Kai and Karate Kid and Joy Luck Club fame will be here in person to be our keynote speaker. And then that weekend, November 12th, we have Kimi Cunningham Grant with her book, Silver Like Dust. She'll be our Zoom author. That's the 12th. And then on Sunday, the 13th, the photographer and writer Shane Sato will be here in person to do a book signing and a lecture. And we will also be revealing our autumn and fall, winter exhibit, which will be his photographs from the Go for Broke spirit, specifically on our Maui soldiers. So that is very exciting. And at his book signing, which will be hybrid, we hear that Tamlin Tomita will be his special guest. So if you missed the dinner and you're interested in meeting Tamlin as well as Shane Sato, please be sure to sign up for that. All of that information is on our website. So please check us out at ndmc.org. Bruce Henderson, I go back to you. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon and for everything leading up to this. We truly, truly appreciate it. And I'd just like to turn it over to you to close out this afternoon.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to join you. I just wish I was in Maui.
We wish you were here too. And if you
Yeah.
ever come to Hawaii, it's just a 20-minute flight over to Maui. We would love to host you.
Well, we've been coming to Hawaii every year for years, and then of course COVID hit and we stayed away. But we'll be back. And thank you again. And I just love telling the stories of these guys, and it's hard for me to let go. So thank you.
We don't want you to let go. All right. Thank you again. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time, and we hope to see you over here on Maui, maybe in 2023.